Okay, Alvaro, so to use a footballing analogy, you are my hat trick today because you will be the third podcast of the day, and so I will call it a perfect hat trick. So left foot, right foot header. And how are you, first of all?
Well, good luck with the hat trick, first of all. I'm good, thank you. Nice to be here again. Been a while, we haven't talked.
Yeah,
And
but all because of really good stuff. So you have a new addition to your family. You've become an uncle. You told me.
it's true for the second time, yes.
So
Yes.
congratulations. Okay, so you already had a nephew and now you have a niece, or is it the other way around?
The other
Or
way around. A niece
okay.
first by my older brother, and now the younger one, Marius, I think you know him. He's got
Hmm.
a little boy.
Fantastic. Okay. So yeah, obviously the family is now waiting for you because you've been overtaken by your little brother. Um,
I'm not sure, I don't feel that kind of social pressure yet, but
good,
it's
good, good,
definitely
good.
nice.
Yeah, after all of these podcasts, I think if there's one thing that's come out, it's social pressure perhaps isn't the best thing to allow yourself to be dictated by. But anyway, it's a wonderful gift to the family to have a new addition. And so obviously we wish the newcomer all the best for a very long and happy life.
Thank you.
Um, yeah. And yeah, so our conversation today, so we already kind of talked about something like this, but we were going to talk about the Stay Behind network. However, you've thrown up an interesting topic, and I think the best thing to do is to let you introduce it.
Well, I suggested the idea to talk also about something that I came across because it has been, turned into a Netflix documentary recently about an episode that looks at that takes place in the after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and how the Eastern German economic system was incorporated into the Western world, the Western German economy, but in general into the capitalist economy uh, by a state organization called Treuhand. I don't know the English term, to be honest.
Trusted agency.
Very good. That's trusted agency. It was just, a kind of euphemism to, if you want, in retrospective, to label what was the main state institution in charge of this um, shift from socialist economy to capitalist economy. And yes, I found there was a connection somehow to our topics because it seems there was some covert action involved too in the assassination. What seemed to me at first in the assassination of the former leader of this state institution called Treuhand, and which was attributed and still is attributed to the Rote Armee-Fraktion, the Army fraction, left-wing terrorist group of the 70s and 80s, especially. And yes, I think that the link was there in terms of, covert action that does not reach or did not reach in its complexity and all its intricacies and implications, the consciousness of the population, as many of the covered actions we have talked about in the past didn't, and especially Stay Behind. So that was the idea of bringing up this topic too.
Hmm. I mean,
I don't know how you see it. How you see this Rohwedder was his name, Rohwedder um, episode.
yeah. For me, it's very interesting because I also first sort of heard about the subject on the basis of, I believe, this particular series. And what also interested me was that there was a comparison, as you alluded to in your introduction, to JFK. They said this is the German JFK, and as you said, the intricacies involved in the John F. Kennedy assassination go far beyond what was the case in Rohwedder. But there are other interesting elements in this case, which I find to be of particular interest to me. I love the comparison between the economies, fascinated by the process of reunification. The general change that occurred was meteoric. And sometimes now looking back at it, 30 years later, it's easy to underestimate the change that occurred directly in Berlin, directly in Germany, but also thereafter around Europe. And then the knock-on effect we can still feel today through global politics. And there is a very, very interesting sort of backstory to the problems that really occurred. So, I don't know how familiar you are, because I believe you were probably born. What year were you born?
88.
88. Okay, yeah. So obviously you don't really remember too much of this, of what happened, but and I'm sure your family and friends have spoken about it. But essentially, there's a lot of mistrust even today between people who are from the former East and people who are from the former West, and not distrust for one another, but the institutional distrust. The motivations behind decisions, the way things were done, and the politics of it, the economics of it, and it's also, as it goes both ways, because people from the former East are critical of how companies came from the West and abroad, as you said, in a globalized world, and they essentially bought out these former East German companies, and then just butchered them. The jobs were basically gone. The people who worked in these factories, in these companies from the former East Germany, they didn't exist anymore. So there was a lot of controversy with regards to how this process in itself came about. On the other hand, there was also a lot of discontent, shall we say, from former West Germans, because they had to pay a certain amount of money every month that came directly out of their paychecks for assisting the former East Germany come up, as it were, to have the same level of infrastructure, of living standards. And this was something that finished this year, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so that payment came to an end this year, and
this is a special tax burden payment imposed on Westerns as an act of solidarity, which was
exactly
in place for a couple of decades. Yes.
Yeah, and so that only came to an end recently. Yeah.
Well, I would distinguish it, however, from the process, the immediate process that took place after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in which this Treuhandanstalt, the trustee trust fund, was involved, trusted agency, which was a state organization by the Western state, West Germany state. So they basically took over those companies that used to be in the hands of a socialist state apparatus, and basically privatized them. That was the main goal, was to adapt them to the financial and economic structures of the Western world. And hand in hand with this process went the privatization and the subsequent dismissal of many employees. Millions lost their jobs. So it was a process that took a couple of years, and it created a lot of discontent in the Eastern Germany population, which at the beginning, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, was very euphoric, you say, about the possibilities of change, about capitalism, which back then in a naive ways they saw as a new way to enter wealth and prosperity quite easily, not anticipating what were then to be the problems involved in it. Privatizations, loss of many jobs, something that they in the Eastern system, Eastern Germany, had never experienced, something like unemployment. Somehow you had your role in this apparatus, and unemployment and this great discontent and created a big distrust vis-a-vis the state, the Western state in general. And well, that's why nowadays you still have a lot of people from East Germany who are an easy target for populism, and especially for right-wing populism in the last years.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many reasons why we could look at that, and they are fascinating topics as well. I wouldn't want to move away too much from Rohwedder, because I think that is the topic that you wanted to discuss essentially. And it is interesting considering this backdrop. There are many other issues that we could also talk about, and maybe one day we should sort of expand the conversation to talk about the reunification and how it was undertaken, and what the subsequent events were as we can look at it now, and analyze whether or not this was a successful project. But with regards to Rohwedder, he was assassinated in his home. The Red Army faction, which obviously in German it's RAF, but for a Brit, when you hear the RAF, we think about the Royal Air Force. Yeah, so that's why when I first got your text message and you said, oh, there's a German politician who was assassinated by the RAF, and I thought, 1 minute, what happened here? But then obviously afterwards I realized you meant the Red Army faction. But these people, they admitted that they had done it, and
exactly, yes,
they were in prison.
It was, I must say, that was kind of let's say my mistake, if you want to assume that there might have been some false flag attack involved, as was the case, as we may later discuss, with the Stay Behind Army, the Gladio network, and so on. So given that it was attributed and it had been had been even admitted by the RAF, the Rote Armee faction, that they had killed this person. So that kind of made it suspicious to me, because in that time, and especially the 2 decades leading up to this murder in 1991 of Rohwedder, a lot of supposedly, allegedly murders allegedly committed by the RAF were later to be discovered to be false flag attacks by right-wing groups. So, but in the connection of Rohwedder, it turned out to me it was pretty certain that this was actually a murder carried out by the left-wing terrorists, because apparently this guy, as the leader of this trustee fund, trust agency, had spurred a lot of resentment in the population in the East. He was seen as the kind of devilish face, was the president of this state agency. So it seems pretty clear that the Rote Armee faction in fact carried out this murder as a symbol. And then later, it seems they have even said, since we could not reach Theo Weigel, which was the finance minister of West Germany at that time, we took him. We murdered this Rohwedder guy.
Well, I mean, Rohwedder, I think, he was offered to have additional security set up, but he dismissed it. And I believe that there was talk that he'd been warned a month before, and yet he didn't heed the warning. You're right to mention false flag operations. Again, it's also possible that the people who actually did kill him had been convinced to do it by other political sources. But then we're talking, then we're going into like a poker syndrome where, what do you have? What do I have? What do you think I have? What do you think I think you think have? As in, it's non-stop thereafter. And that's where a lot of theories start to fall apart because there's no actual proof to suggest that there are other elements involved. However, I do also remember when I came across in Italy the case of Aldo Moro, and there was La Brigata Rossa, I believe, which was involved.
La Brigata Rossa.
Yeah, and again, not too far, shall we say, with regards to names, nor indeed ideology. And yet, in that case, Aldo Moro was, I believe, a socialist, unless I'm mistaken, a rising star.
He was a conservative.
Okay. Yes. But a liberal conservative, as in a rising star in the.
He was a politician who said to have tried to overcome the antagonism between communists, left and right, and try to search a peace agreement, if you want, on a political level. And that spurs the idea, the suspicion that it was, in fact, it could have been a covert action then carried out, maybe even carried out by the Brigate Rosse, which was the equivalent of the Red Army faction in Germany, if you want. And yes, it is not really clear what exactly was behind this murder of Aldo Moro. Don't even recall the year now. But in this case, it could, in fact, be more probable that there was some sort of covert action involved.
I'm pretty certain with regards to Aldo Moro, because I can't see why a sympathizer, somebody who wanted to bring into mainstream politics these leftist influencers, why should somebody like that be taken up by the left? It makes no sense to me. And it's quite simple. If somebody publicly supports your movement, you normally get behind that person. You don't take them out. And so therefore,
but I think you should also take into account that radical factions, be it on the right or on the left, they would also fear for certain for a certain agreement between right and for a peace between the right and left, because they gain their power and their influence and their role through this antagonism. So it cannot be discarded that even the Red Army, the Brigate Rosse, may have had an interest also in killing him.
Yeah, but there are many questions that remain about the Red Brigade, which, with regards to the Red Army faction, aren't necessarily the case, because the Red Army faction continued to operate in the way that they did until they were arrested. And I think a lot of them, even now, those who remain, who are in prison, that was it. After the leadership was arrested for another crime, I think they tried to kill somebody else. After they were arrested, thereafter the group's ability to mobilize itself was greatly diminished. Whereas in Italy, the Red Brigade, nobody was really caught. And that kind of lends itself to the thought, okay, what's missing? So that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't necessarily put the murder of Rohwedder in that bracket. So therefore, I agree with you to say that it probably isn't a false flag. Though you could obviously point to the fact that why did they assassinate this individual, when perhaps there would have been a far more effective course of action to try to produce, I don't know, social activity, demonstrations against what was going on. Maybe that's far too, peaceful an option. Maybe it's easy to look back at it now and say, why didn't you just talk about it? Maybe they had been trying to talk about it. But yeah, I think these people were dead set on violence, and that was simply the way that they chose to communicate.
Yes, I agree. In terms of Rohwedder, I assume same. But maybe we should come to talk about what really is much more probable were false flag attacks than attributed to the Brigate Rosse in Italy. Speaking of stay behind network and the branch of it in Italy called Gladio. Because since you mentioned the Brigate Rosse in first place, it is in fact known, let's say, today, that the Brigate Rosse were allegedly said to have committed big stragi, bomb attacks, terrorist attacks in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And it turned out later that these were actions carried out by right-wing terrorist groups who counted on the false flag idea of later blaming the left for it, and by this shifting the political paradigm to the right, to the more conservative, and to give more power to secret services and inner security, shifting what was threatening to become a shift towards the left, because the Communist Party of Italy back then was strong, really strong. They reached over 30%. And yes, these attacks strangely happened just right before elections. And in the elections, it turned out that that the main motivation to shift the equilibrium towards more conservative right-wing policy worked. The plan worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, I would take things back to the Marshall Plan, where essentially the post-war governments decided to split the world into two spheres of influence, and essentially the Soviet Union agreed to its eastern sphere, and the Western democracies sort of created their own sphere. And Italy and Germany quite clearly were within, or the former West Germany were quite clearly within the Western zone. And one of the parts of the deal was that Soviet Russia, or the Soviet Union, would not assist Communist Party sympathizers or communist sympathizers in Western countries. And so therefore, these stay-behind networks were essentially there as an additional force to make sure that there was no direct attacks carried out, but also that had there been any undercover operations, that there would have been groups on the ground that could immediately act against those particular interests. But they also obviously wanted to move the local populations of those countries away from considering communism as a viable political option. And this is essentially the work that the Gladio did throughout Italy in those years, but also in the different names that they had in the different countries. Each country had its own name, and it was extensive. And if you look at it now, you could say particularly successful. It would also be interesting for us to be able to analyze it on another occasion, exactly why the West considers communism and its little brother socialism to be such a bad approach to managing society. And I think that's something that we would probably have to really consider from a number of different perspectives. But to go back to this initial one with regards to Rohwedder, because of the time, because of the years and what had preceded it, and because we've lived through in the last 20 years after 9/11 lots of different little terrorist explosions or attacks that have been carried out in the European Union or in European countries. And to a lesser extent, in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. What we had before the Soviet Union collapsed was also quite extensive and over a long period of time. And so the question remains whether or not these events played a big role in shaping the political environment of the post-war years as a result.
Yes, that's the question. It would be necessary to analyze every country by country, because it was a network, covered network operating in the whole of Europe, and it was under the under the control of the NATO back then, of the U.S. intelligence, and it had different branches, as you hinted at before. Only, I think the reason why Gladio was to become the most known branch of this network is because it in fact had a major influence on local politics, on Italian politics, and whereas the operations of this network in the other countries of Germany may not have had this type of influence in shaping the political landscape of this time. Gladio, in fact, as I hinted at before, operated very efficiently because the U.S. intelligence managed to gather a lot of, let's call them Nazi or fascist exiles, and join forces and create a network that was meant to work. In first place, the idea was to operate in the case of a post-nuclear war scenario, in which they thought that Soviet Union, for instance, would be mainly the industry would be destroyed by atomic warfare, but still there would have been a country and a society and a lot of things to manage. So the idea of the stay behind network in first place was to create a plan that was to be carried out in the occasion of such post-nuclear situation. And this was the main idea driving the first attempts of this U.S. intelligence to counter what was then regarded as the threat of the Soviet system. So we're talking about 46, right after the Second World War, when these stay-behind networks were created and established in the upcoming years. And then through the connections.
Sorry, but in 46 is quite early. So if they were established then, they would have been established on an unofficial basis. And I think that they were made official later on after the Western countries actually formalized their security agencies, because I believe the CIA didn't exist until later on.
CIA existed from 47.
Yeah.
And one must say my readings that I did before this talk suggested that before the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, whose role it was later to carry out operations in other countries, there were different players in the U.S. intelligence world. One was called Central Intelligence Corps, and it was this apparently this network that in 47 was also still operating as a as a network that was carrying out operations in other countries, covert operations. So it was back then in 47 that this was officially unrolled. This plan, the Stay Behind network, came into existence back then.
Okay.
And it gradually shifted a bit its focus, but this was also due to the fact to something that I found very interesting in this analysis of a secret intelligence historian from the US called Simpson. He was suggesting that the US intelligence, the real core of it, did not have such a big control, not even knowledge of so much what was being carried out by the branches within the countries. There were branches also in the Soviet world, in the post-Soviet world of Ukraine, for instance, and there were the branches in Europe. So the idea he was suggesting is that the U.S. intelligence did not have so much knowledge about, but let them, put certain ideas and intentions in these networks' motivations heads, and let them operate more or less under the general plan to undermine Soviet influence and this system and the political threat of the socialist idea also for Europe. So I found this idea pretty interesting.
Yeah. I've also read about how the early post-war years, the Allies essentially relied upon the Nazi network in spying on the Soviet Union. So Gehlen and his network, which eventually became the BND, were perhaps also involved in military briefings for the USA and other countries because they were there. And so
more than military briefings, this Gehlen group is known. This name I've read a lot about in connection to Stay Behind networks and Gladio, because this branch in Germany was exactly a collaboration between the U.S. intelligence part and Gehlen group, which was then later to become BND, or which can give an idea of how the idea of BND and Secret Service was influenced by this general Western U.S. intelligence policy.
Yeah, I mean, this all comes down to essentially how much the West feared communism, and it's something that we've also touched upon when we talked about the French Revolution, because we also talked thereafter about the impact that the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution had on Western society, and how the assassination of the Tsar and his entire family completely horrified the West, and the idea that such an idea could or such a political ideology could somehow spread again in the 20th century was horrific, and that they would do anything they could to stop that from happening.
And with regards to the covert action strategies of U.S. intelligence, one must say that there are two lines of action, if you want. One is the one in the decades of the rule of the Nazi Party, and covert action, as you in the upcoming of this conversation, you mentioned GoldenEye as a operation that was in fact a covert action plan against Nazi the Nazi regime and the threat of the Nazi regime. So when
in Spain, that was in Spain during the war, though, right?
Exactly. And as the war ended and the Nazi regime was finished, there was a new threat, a threat that never had ceased to be a threat from the time that you mentioned, the 1970, because back then, what now are the two big, or well, until the fall of the Soviet Union, to be the two major antagonistic principles governing West and East respectively came to a it started back then in the first decades of the second century. And one thing I found interesting in my readings is that the secret agent, a guy called Boris Pesch, I think it was his name, he was so old. He was part of the Stay Behind network, if you want, involved in this. But he was so old that he had been already in place in the secret service world in the 1917 revolution. So in that time, there was already something going on. So to come back to what I said before, it was back then that this antagonism first came up. Then the Nazi regime posed the biggest threat to U.S. interests in Europe. So it shifted there. All covert action, all general foreign policy shifted to fighting the Nazi regime. And then this turns the older antagonism between communism and capitalism, if you want to put it bluntly, came up again in 46, 47 this time, when new strategies were developed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in many ways it's interesting to consider the thought processes that must have taken place when Britain, France, and the Soviet Union teamed up to fight this, National Socialism that had emerged so dramatically in 1933. But then obviously is the war, as it were, that began as a response to the invasion of Poland in 1939. But it's interesting, I guess, also to understand the motivations behind that alliance, because quite clearly for Britain and France, early on, this is before the USA joined the alliance, for them it was difficult to get into bed with a communist country. But clearly they identified Hitler's Nazis as a far greater evil, if I can use the word evil. And afterwards, maybe we can talk about this as well. But, if Stalin were to be considered the lesser evil, which I don't think we should really be able to compare two evils, but it's interesting what must have motivated them to set up that alliance, to then fight against the Nazis. But then, as you say, they were eventually victorious at huge cost to every side that had involved itself. And the idea was to come up with this international network, which would be more successful than whatever agreements that they had in place in the interwar period, because the League of Nations clearly was not a successful model. And then they created the United Nations. There were a number of different treaties involved between the countries, the Treaty of Rome as well, to introduce economic unity, but this working together.
You're talking about the post-Second World War period now.
Yes, post-Second World War, yeah. And it's interesting to try to understand their various motivations, because what we've got is a world of leaders who want to come together officially, but under the surface, there is a framework in every country which is preparing for battle. So I asked myself exactly how sincere were they in trying to come together, and indeed, were the main figures Kennedy and Brezhnev, in this case, I would imagine, if we look at the Cold War, were they removed because it was too likely that there would be a unity? And so after 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, then we see this, what I would imagine, this growth of assassinations, this growth of violence, not only in the USA, but also in Europe, because essentially they had, or whatever these networks were, they had decided, we do not at any cost want to consider the possibility of a peaceful solution. It's them or us, never them and us.
But you mean the coalition of Western Europe states now? Still, which networks which interests were you referring to now?
Well, on both sides. On both sides. I mean, in the West, obviously, you've got NATO, you've got the secret agencies, the British agencies, you've got the CIA, you've got the BND, but you've also got, the former East German Stasi, you've got the KGB.
Mm-hmm.
So as in every side has its own little network which exists below the government that we can all see.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that all of these groups, none of them wanted to sit at a desk and speak peacefully. They wanted to do what they wanted to do.
I mean, if you're talking about covered actions and networks, these networks of hidden structures that are not in public and don't even come to public awareness because they operate in a hidden way. They have their power from they get their power from concealing information, from operating under the veil, and without having to take responsibility for their actions. So whoever was involved in some sort of secret endeavor on both sides, of course, had never had a genuine interest in bringing about some kind of peace between the two worlds. I want to call them like this.
So what we see essentially is this vast network of cells. These are essentially cells, domestic cells. Now, whether you consider them to be terrorist cells or not, that is completely dependent upon your ideology. But we do have these cells. These cells have access to weapons stashes all over the individual countries in which they exist. The reason why we consider this entire network Gladio is because Andreotti was the first person or first leader to come out and say they exist. And so that's why everybody looks at it and says, oh, Gladio. And that's what essentially made that name famous, was because of that. They were the first to come out. But because there is another argument which we could perhaps go into on another occasion, because there's so much to discuss before that. Yeah. But essentially, the fall of the Soviet Union left a lot of these agencies, holding a lot of weapons without any clear target to point at. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. The fall of Soviet Union, or do you mean the fall of the Nazi regime?
No. The fall of the Soviet Union, because we're talking about post-war stay-behind networks. Yeah. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, you had these stay-behind networks where, okay, there is no more a fear that the Soviet Union is going to somehow influence communist sympathizers in Western democratic countries. So, what are they going to do? Where is the target? And I do believe so. Therefore, we will perhaps have to look at the shift all of a sudden from Cold War status to the Middle East. Which happened quite quickly. If I'm not mistaken, the first Gulf War occurred in 91, right? So
next target. First, it was Nazi regime, second, Soviet system, and in the end, the new threat is the Muslim terrorism. And
they call it. I think it's fundamentalism. Yeah, and fundamental.
Yeah, that's
Islam.
A better way to phrase it. Yes.
Yeah, fundamental Islam. But before we get to any of that, we are still talking about the topics of these networks within the European Union, because that's what we know most. As in, these networks, I think, pretty much carried out their their attacks in South American countries, in African countries, in other parts of Asia. We have no idea. As in, it will take any number of months, I suppose, to become even moderately familiar with all of the work that they did, trying to undermine local governments and creating their own sympathetic regimes. But we do have this situation where we no longer knew whether or not it was the Red Army faction that had shot Rohwedder, at least in the initial stages, even though they claimed it practically immediately and said that this was our work. But because of all of this, all of these events, all of these terrorist plots that had taken place in the preceding 20 or 30 years, it wasn't clear, exactly what was going on, who had done it, was it really them, and who was behind it, who was behind the shooter, essentially. And I think that's also a part of what you were alluding to when we came to talk about whether or not we'll discuss Rohwedder, was because of the just the environment that had been created. It couldn't simply be a question of the Red Army faction doing what they did, because what about all the others? What about the right wing terrorists? Was this something that had been organized by some other faction? Was this
one thing that should be emphasized is the fact that after the Second World War, when these secret stay-behind networks came into existence, there was a shift in the strategy of U.S. intelligence. So when before they had been fighting Nazis and there was the so-called Entnazifizierungsprozess in Germany. So the general, the alleged goal was to cleanse all the German system of any elements of the past, of the Third Reich. But then there was a shift in this strategy, in the general strategy, in foreign policy, intelligence strategy. So instead of fighting these people they connected or they saw as major and important historic roles in the Third Reich apparatus, so they tried to incorporate those with strong knowledge of how things work, like Gehlen, into their new strategy, which was to direct covert actions against the communist threat, if you want. So this shift in strategy is very interesting. That the supposed enemy, in the moment, the supposed enemy in terms of ideology, in the moment that the enemy itself as a political system that works and has warfare and can participate in warfare and so on, like the Nazi regime, when it ceases to exist, there's a new ideological enemy, and to combat this new ideological enemy, you incorporate the late enemies, to fight, to make use of their knowledge and their anti-Soviet motivation.
I mean, I guess you could look at it from the perspective that this is a shift in policy. You could also perhaps look at it in another way, which says that this is actually the establishment of what has become known as Nazi International. That after the Second World War, the leaders that had run things during Hitler's Germany had distributed their network around the world, and it took them time to get reorganized. And perhaps they saw the savior to their way of doing things by incorporating that into the new structures that had been created by the victors, as it were. But it was also quite early on in their thinking that for example, Operation Paperclip, they saved as many useful Nazis as they could, as did the Soviet Union. And Adenauer's government, his cabinet was full of former Nazis. So it was a far easier process to include these elements than it was to get rid of them. And in fact, I'm trying to get to speak to somebody who is a bit of a specialist on the Nuremberg trials. I'm not sure I will be able to do that. So if not, then I'm going to have to go into all of the research and try to find something myself. But all of this is an interesting backdrop to what became, the Cold War. And what we're analyzing here, backwards and forwards, with the different bits of information that we have, it is interesting because it has somehow brought us into the current world in which we live. And we look at it and we say, okay, the Second World War finished over 70 years ago, and still our societies are not able to function in a peaceful way. We still have divisions. We still have huge inequalities that we have to deal with. Even though technology has gone forward, human enlightenment has done nothing of the sort. And the question has to be asked, why is that the case? And maybe the answer lies in some of the evidence that we are pointing out ourselves. We were never really given a chance. Ever since the Second World War, something has made us stay alert to potential danger. Always.
There's always some, let's call it, geopolitical antagonism between major forces. There's always some potential of warfare and the threat, and the militarization still goes on. I mean, and that has never come to an end. And atomic warfare is and nuclear war is still unfortunately possible. And yes, it's I think the main way to go is to make knowledge more available. All these things that we talk about are still in the realm connected to the world of, let's call it conspiracy theories and so on, but they are important to show how forces, even also hidden from public consciousness, mostly hidden, work and shape the geopolitical landscape in the first place, and then this is also a major driving force in how our societies within the states, even in the Western world, are constituted.
Yeah, absolutely. And many questions will continue to arise from what kind of education we're talking about, who will put that education together, and will it be successful in righting the ills of society? You also said that there will always be this kind of aggression somewhere around the world because of geopolitics. Why? Is that a defeatist mentality? Am I naive? Is the reality somewhere in between?
It has to be like this. On the contrary, I think that the more we know, the more we get aware of how things work, the more we can shape also our political systems and try to, in our small possibilities, try to work for a better system within one's own country first. And I think the way is through emancipation, through knowledge. And I don't see that, maybe I put it in the wrong way. I don't think that these forces are necessary. It's just that when looking back in history, things always seem, they follow some logical patterns, and it seems somehow, yes, unescapable. But that's how you. That's the difference about looking looking back into history and looking forward. Learn from the history mistakes, right?
Okay. So in your opinion, just to bring to an end, because we have this sort of psychological limit of an hour. I think most people's attention span probably closes after about 30 minutes. But just to bring to in your mind, if I were to ask you, is there anything particularly sinister other than indeed the act itself of the Rohwedder assassination? Are you quite clear in your mind that it was the Red Army faction?
Well, to be honest, to make it clear, I heard about this case, as I said in the beginning, only recently through this Netflix documentary. A friend told me of this episode, so I did my first investigations and actually saw another documentary. Didn't finish the Netflix one, which is more, meant to be a kind of story, dramatized and so on. But I saw another documentary, and I think. My impression was that there's not necessarily major covert action behind the alleged murder by the Red Army faction. I think the immediate reason, and what was the driving reason behind the murder is pretty clear if you see what the work of this institution was. And I do think, as you also hinted at before, that there are some networks, some terrorist groups that just operate through violence, and this was a symbolic act directed against what was seen as the capitalist takeover of the Eastern German economy.
Okay, fair enough. I from what I've read of the Rohwedder assassination, I think I agree that they did have the people who had done it in prison, even though they weren't actually tried for that particular murder. But they did admit that it was them, and I think German society is satisfied that justice was indirectly done, even if they were never actually tried for it.
The actual murderer of this person is not known. So it is attributed to the Red Army faction, but he's not has never stood trial for that.
No, but I think he died in prison before he was able to stand trial, if I'm not mistaken. I don't mean to. I don't mean to do a spoiler for you, but I think that's probably what happened. Okay, Alvaro. We used Rohwedder, this poor man, as a means of opening up many different avenues of conversation for finding a way forward to what we will perhaps see as the enlightened future that lies ahead of us. I wonder how far ahead it is indeed. But there are shoots of hope, I guess. Alvaro, thank you. It's Good Friday, and you definitely set my mind aflutter with some of your thoughts. So let us see what we come up with on our next conversation.
Yes, I'm glad to have talked to you, and I hope we can deepen some of the topics we've talked about, or touch them in some other occasion.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to it. And after this, I'm sure we'll make plans for our next one. So thank you very much, Alvaro, and speak to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.